Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webcast. I'm Amy Pendergrass with Moss Adams, and I'm going to get us started for today's session, Medicare Update 2022 Inpatient Prospective Payment System Proposed Rule. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us. We're pleased to present another in our ongoing series of continuing professional education webcasts to help companies and individuals conquer challenges as they plan for what's next. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget to the right of the slide view. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window below the slide view and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session will offer you one CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of the polling questions, which we'll ask throughout today's presentation. To respond to a poll, click the button next to your answer. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget to open a PDF file that you can save to your computer. Don't worry if you can't download your PDF certificate today. We'll email a copy to you in 2 weeks. If you're attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our attendance sheet to receive CPE credit. The attendance sheet is available in the slide deck and handouts widget. Please have all group members sign it and send only one sheet per group. Also note that CPE credit can be awarded only to participants registered as themselves and isn't available to participants who view the on-demand version. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see isn't legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
And now I would like to introduce today's presenters, Paul Holden, partner at Moss Adams, Glenn Bunting, director at Moss Adams, and Michael Newell, partner at Moss Adams. Their bios and contact information are located in your webcast console if you would like more information. And now I would like to turn the floor over to Paul to get the presentation started. Paul?
Thank you, Amy. Good morning, everyone. We appreciate you spending an hour with us today. A lot of information to cover with this most recent proposed rule from CMS. We're going to be covering a number of areas. We'll start out with MSDRG updates. We'll talk about payment rates. We'll also cover graduate medical education, a very interesting and important development in the area of GME going forward. And then I will pass it over to Glenn to do a deep dive on wage index, a lot of really important information to cover there. And then Mike will share with us updates on Medicare DISH and uncompensated care. We're going to talk about Section 1115 waivers. We're going to talk about the repeal of market-based data collection, which plays an important role in rate setting. And we'll cover that in brief detail, mainly because there was an implementation and then a repeal. And then we'll also talk about some other related proposed rule items. But with that, Amy, I'll send it back to you for our first polling question.
All right, thank you, Paul. So our first polling question, do you or your team plan to comment on CMS's 2022 IPPS rulemaking? A, yes, B, no, or C, unsure. And we'll give you a few moments to respond. To respond, please click the button next to the answer you choose and hit Submit. Also, if you have questions during the webcast, please submit them using the Q&A window in your console. We do expect to have a full agenda today, so if we don't have time to respond during the webcast, we will do our best to follow up with you afterwards. And it looks like most everyone has had a chance to submit. So here are the results.
Great, thank you, Amy. Appreciate everyone responding to that. For those who are unsure, this is an opportunity to provide feedback to CMS. As a reminder, you have up until 5 p.m. Eastern on June 28th. There are a number of items in here that Mike and Glenn especially will share with you where it is important to provide feedback to CMS on what the provider community is actually experiencing versus what the rulemaking data files actually tell the federal government. So just an important area to always reemphasize, which applies to any rulemaking CMS implements throughout the year. We also wanted to talk about, in relation to MSDRG's NTAP, CMS is proposing to approve 14 of 16 new technology add-on payments starting in federal fiscal year 2022. There was an interesting graphic that I located preparing for the presentation where the number of NTAP applications has increased exponentially since 2003. Each year from 2003 up until the early teens, there was anywhere between 5 and 10 NTAP applications that were being submitted to CMS. In 2021, that shot up close to 30. Now, the number of applications that are being submitted relative to the approvals is tracking, but certainly more applications submitted than are being approved. But the distribution is also changing between those that are submitted for devices, a significant portion for drugs, and then a smaller portion for diagnostic. So just something to be aware of. We've received several questions recently around NTAP, and it's important not only from a rulemaking perspective, but also from a payer contracting perspective as well. So something to bring to your attention. Just a reminder on CAR-T, obviously when we're talking about immunotherapy and other items in relation to NTAP, there's a lot of information in the rule around CAR-T immunotherapy. And then also we're still waiting on instructions from CMS surrounding items such as bone marrow transplantation and some other areas that might affect the construct of the cost report itself. In regard to payment rate updates, starting 10/1 of 21, CMS is currently proposing a 2.8% increase. This is made up of our standard market basket adjustment, multi-factor productivity adjustments, and then there also are some statute items that are being incorporated as well. Overall, CMS is anticipating about a $2.5 billion increase in IPPS payments to providers for the next federal fiscal year. How that breaks down is we're seeing about a 2.8% increase in the actual numbers. You can see here from the final correction notice breakdown. This is the DRG weight of 1 for providers above wage index value of 1 and below 1, and you can see the distribution between labor and non-labor, but an increase nonetheless. And we're also seeing an interesting shift as well in how these items are coming through, and we'll talk about that a little bit in relation to which cost report and MedPAR data CMS used for this year. How we arrive at that is what CMS takes is the prior year base rate, they remove their reduction factors, and then they apply the current year changes for different CMS programs to arrive at the current year base payment rate. The reason why we like to present this slide each year is each of these programs can change for where Medicare is adding payments, such as the market basket update, adding certain items such as wage index budget neutrality or macro adjustments. But then there are also a number of areas where they take funds out of your base payment rate to fund other areas, such as the lowest quartile wage index budget neutrality factor, or removing 5.1% of your payments for operating outliers each year. So it's important to understand each year where Medicare is giving and where Medicare is taking away in order to arrive at that DRG weight of 1. Regarding the market basket update, you can see the full spectrum from those who submit quality data and meaningfully use EHR to those who are doing neither. And as you can see on the bottom, it's a full market basket swing from the high end of the full update of 2.3%, and this is before the 0.5% add-on by statute, all the way down to negative 0.2% if you're not submitting quality data and you're not using EHR in a meaningful way. One interesting area to note is how CMS is approaching their rulemaking this year. Because they anticipate that because of COVID, the 2020 information could skew rulemaking, they have decided to use prior year cost report data along with prior year MedPAR data, and it'll be very interesting to see in the comments in the final rule providers, the American Hospital Association, and others pushing back on this. And I know Glenn and Mike will talk about implications that this has for wage index and also DISH and UC, but it's always very important that CMS is using the most current data, but it will be also interesting to see commentary around outlier cases, acuity of patients, case mix index, all of those areas, along with the guidance that has come out regarding how to record certain COVID funding, lab tests, uncompensated care, those types of items. So this slide should have an asterisk that says more to come on it. It'll be very interesting to see where CMS goes in terms of final rulemaking. And the reason why that's important is we wanted to remind everyone the construct of how the IPPS payment methodology is determined each year. A lot of folks will say, well, you know, if I'm a PPS provider, I don't really have to worry about, you know, cost to charge ratios or, you know, Medicare share of cost. I'm really mostly focused on those areas that generate settlement. And the unfortunate part in that thinking is that every area of the cost report in some way, shape, or form, whether it's claims, cost to charge ratios, patient days, all of those items are used by CMS in their rulemaking. So it's very important that when you're developing cost to charge ratios, when you're using CMS's prescribed cost centers, when you're determining Medicare or Medicaid's share of cost using your cost report, that you're telling the most accurate and compliant story possible, because eventually it will use to determine some form of either prospective payment, or if you're a critical access hospital, it's determining your current year due to, due from. Along with our comment around the use of cost report and MedPAR data, we wanted to show that for the proposed cost to charge ratios that CMS is going to be using, they are proposing that they are unchanged from prior year, which is very important. And it could play into how they determine these numbers for the final rule. But you can see here in the change column that across the board, we had mostly a downward continuing trend from federal fiscal year 20 to federal fiscal year 21 in terms of the development of cost to charge ratios. This year, if it is unchanged, it'll be very interesting to see the effect that has on net payment rates. But this is very important to understand as we're looking at those items with charge master changes each year, or how clinics are being enrolled or changed between freestanding or provider-based, analyzing overhead allocations to non-reimbursable cost centers, revenue integrity, charge capture, all of those items and areas of your operation play into these calculations each year. And it's very important to monitor those cost to charge ratios that are on the lowest end of the spectrum. When we're looking at CT scans, we're looking at MRIs, or we're looking at cardiac catheterization, these are items where they can be low cost relative to the charge. But we're also in a period as well where many providers are looking at CapEx and asking, do we need to reinvest in our infrastructure? Do we need to refresh our CT scanner? Do we need to buy a new MRI? Do we need to make changes to our operating suites to meet the demands of our patients. So all of that will play into cost report information and cost to charge ratio development going forward, because if the costs start to change relative to charges, that will impact rulemaking here. And with that, Amy, I'll pass it over to you for our second polling question.
All right, thank you. So our second question is, changes in cost to charge ratios affect A, outlier payments on claims, B, calculation of uncompensated care on worksheet S10, C, rate setting, D, cost report settlements for critical access hospitals, or E, all of the above. And as a reminder, if you would like to receive CPE credit for today's webcast, you will need to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions. Okay, we'll leave this up here for another 5 seconds or so. All right, Paul, here are the results.
Thank you, Amy. Yeah, absolutely. Letter E, all of the above. Certainly for those folks who answered A, B, C, and D, incredibly important. But yes, it's very interesting to see how these cost to charge ratios come together, not only at the cost center level, but overall. When we're talking about that cost to charge ratio that feeds to line 1 of S10, Mike may touch on it, but we'll certainly be touching on it in other presentations. CMS is also providing new guidance on how that cost to charge ratio is going to come together. And then certainly for outlier payments on claims, as we look at the changing acuity of our patient mix with COVID and other pandemic-related items, it's going to be very important to understand the resources that are used by Medicare beneficiaries relative to what is actually being paid. Speaking of outliers, we have an updated proposed threshold of $30,967. Last year's final was $29,051. As we mentioned before, CMS estimates each year that about 5.1% of total operating DRG payments will be paid in the form of an outlier payment, but they do revisit this each year as part of rulemaking and identified that for 2020, about 5.42% of DRG payments were related to outliers. It's very interesting on this anecdotally, as the Medicare payer mix begins to shift between fee-for-service and managed care. It's going to be very interesting to see if CMS will revisit this 5.1%, because that percent has been in place for many, many years, but the profile of patients in the inpatient setting is evolving rapidly. So it'll be interesting to see if CMS starts to do any retrospective analysis around that. With regard to GME, we wanted to point out here that CMS is proposing to expand training. This is big news. Obviously, there's lots of criteria around this. We will be putting out some additional content around this item, but it is good to see that as part of this Consolidated Appropriations Act, we are seeing these new 1,000 Medicare-funded GME slots that will be going out nationwide. Critically important for training residents and getting new physicians into communities, both urban and rural. Obviously, this initiative is very rural focused, but it's critically important to allow those facilities to get these slots, get their FTE counts in there, get those physicians trained, and get reimbursed for them as well. We know that Medicare doesn't provide 100% reimbursement, but certainly better than having a cap of 50 and training 75 residents, because we know the financial burden that places on providers as well who are getting those physicians trained up. So with that, Glenn, I think I used my first 20 minutes of our presentation, so I will pass it over to you to dig into wage index.
All right, thanks, Paul. I thought we would start off today's wage index topic with a discussion on CMS's proposed versus alternative data proposal. What is this about and how does it impact your wage index values? Let's go through the proposal set forth on the slide. CMS is proposing to use, as Paul indicated, they're proposing to use the fiscal year 2019 data for fiscal year 2022 payment rates. And this is for they're choosing this for circumstances where the fiscal year 2020 data is significantly impacted by the COVID. CMS considered an alternative approach of using the data they would ordinarily use in the 2020 rule or rate setting, such as the fiscal year 2020 MedPAR data file and the fiscal year 2019 HCRIS file. But right now, CMS is in a position where they're soliciting comments on this alternative approach and are making available various 2022 data files based upon our ordinary data sources. And as Paul indicated earlier, all comments to the proposed rule must be submitted by June 28th, 5 p.m. Eastern Time. One question that kind of comes up in this topic is, what does CMS mean by circumstances where the fiscal year 2020 data is significantly impacted by COVID? How is CMS making this determination? Are they using a combination of fiscal year 2019 and fiscal year 2020 data sources based upon some threshold that really hasn't been thrown out there and isn't transparent? From what I can tell, CMS is not entirely clear on these points, but nevertheless, let's dive into the data and see what the results are from these two approaches. In order to understand CMS's proposed versus alternative data proposal, I decided to look at 5 random rural areas across the U.S. and using the data from tables 2 and 3 provided by CMS in the IPPS preliminary rule, the results are shown on the slide. So I started with California, and I just took a look at what the data set showed. The 2 data sets showed for rural areas, and we can see that they're very, very similar. From there, I went to Texas and also saw similar results. Same thing in Florida, New York, and then finally Wisconsin. I just kind of circled the nation, just looking randomly at different rural areas. And so, the takeaway based upon our sample of rural core-based statistical areas across the U.S. is that the proposed wage index values using the 2019 data are virtually identical to the alternative of using 2020 data. I also looked at other rural areas not shown on this slide and found similar results. Next, using the same 5 states from the previous slide, I selected one geographic urban area for our comparison. So similarly, for our sample of urban areas, the proposed wage index values using 2019 data are virtually identical to the alternative data using 2020 data. And you can see I chose San Francisco for California, and then going to Texas, I looked at Houston, and then for Florida, I looked at Miami, and New York City for New York, and then Milwaukee for Wisconsin. And again, the results are very similar. So at this point, you may be concluding that CMS's proposed versus alternative data approach is about equal, and there's really nothing materially different between the 2 approaches. Well, I would caution you and just say not so fast. Within the IPPS preliminary rule in Table 2, CMS includes a column of data setting forth case mix index values. Many of you are probably familiar with that column. For each of our urban areas from the previous slide, I zeroed in and selected one random provider and examined the changes to their case mix index based upon CMS's proposed versus alternative data sets. And the results are illustrated on the slide, and they're consistent for most providers nationwide. In other words, most everybody is seeing a lot of fluctuation. There's a lot of wide variation in these case mix values between the 2 data sets, with the fiscal year 2019 data set being lower than fiscal year 2020. So thus, while the proposed versus alternative wage index values were basically stagnant or the same, we find there's a significant difference in the case mix index values if CMS's proposed 2019 data values are accepted. Again, the proposed values are based upon a pre-COVID period, while the alternative data set that we would normally be using would include the effects of treating COVID patients as it's derived from 2020 data. Providers are going to need to submit comments to CMS expressing their desire and reasoning for utilizing the fiscal year 2020 data set if they want to receive the higher fiscal year 2020 case mix index values. It's just as simple as that. The 2020 case mix index values, in my view, contain a more accurate representation of patient care provided within this last year than the 2019 values. And again, the deadline to submit comments to CMS, again, is June 28th by 5 p.m. Eastern. Shifting gears, and as a refresher, before you use a slide setting forth the current uses of the Medicare wage index factor, many folks still don't realize that there are two wage index factors that are calculated for every provider, the adjusted factor and the unadjusted factor. We're all used to using the adjusted factor because it's the focus of Medicare inpatient and outpatient payments for hospitals, which many folks don't realize comprise about 85% of all Medicare expenditures. The adjusted area wage index factor applies the occupational mix survey data, while the unadjusted area wage index does not. However, the unadjusted wage index factor is used in approximately 15% of the remaining Medicare expenditures for services related to skilled nursing facilities, inpatient rehabs, inpatient psychiatric facilities, ESRD, hospice, home health, and other payment systems. So interestingly, while these other programs have their wage index factor tied to hospital wage index data, typically the use of this data trails in its release by a few years, depending upon each program. Thus, the unadjusted wage index factor tied to hospital providers in 1 year will not be the same unadjusted wage index factor used by non-hospital providers in the same year. There is a lag in the use of the wage index values by program. Also, as a friendly reminder, a hospital's wage index value effectively influences, on average, about 90% of the Medicare payment received by hospitals. In terms of new proposals offered up in the Inpatient Prospective Payment System preliminary rule, CMS is proposing to reestablish the imputed floor. So CMS had originally implemented the imputed floor in a budget-neutral manner, meaning that CMS reduced payments to hospitals nationwide to pay for the imputed floor. CMS discontinued that practice because in 2019 because it was concerned that the budget neutrality adjustment was putting hospitals in states with rural areas at a disadvantage. But along comes Section 9831 of the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, which was enacted just a couple of months ago, and it instructs CMS to revive the imputed floor policy with the modification that it will not be applied in a budget neutral manner. So accordingly, CMS is following Congress's lead. They're proposing to reestablish the imputed floor policy beginning in this cycle, 2022, but with the caveat that they're not going to be imposing a budget neutrality adjustment. So it's going to be reestablished, but it won't be at the expense of all other hospitals that don't use it. Another new proposal coming from the IPPS preliminary rule is a proposal to address the timing for canceling rural status. So CMS is proposing to change when a hospital can request to cancel its election to reclassify as rural. The Medicare statute and regulations permit hospitals to elect to reclassify as rural for purposes of the prospective payment systems. When hospitals make this election, its wage and hours data is included in the rural area wage index factor for the following federal fiscal year, unless the hospital cancels its reclassification at least 120 days prior to the beginning of that year. And what CMS has found is that hospitals in certain states were reclassifying as rural, and then they would cancel their reclassification soon after approval so that their wage data did not negatively affect the rural wage index of the following year. So CMS is addressing this. They're proposing to impose a minimum 1 year time period between the time a hospital reclassifies as rural and the time it may cancel that election. And, you know, CMS is proposing this change in a manner that's actually very consistent with their longstanding practice of implementing policies aimed at achieving equity for all IPPS providers. There's no real surprise with this one. Other items that are still on the table that are continuing to be in motion is CMS is proposing to continue to implement its low wage index hospital policy, which you can see notated on the slide. They're also proposing to continue several policies that they've adopted in recent years, including but not limited to the following, which some were changes to the labor market delineations based upon revisions to the OMB core-based statistical areas stemming from the OMB Bulletin 1804. They are continuing to do calculation analysis and implementation of the occupational mix adjustment to the wage index for acute care hospitals for this cycle, but now it's going to be based on the recent calendar year 2019 occupational mix survey. They're continuing to do the application of the rural floor and the frontier state floors. Revisions to your wage index can still be made through geographic reclassifications. There are certain changes that have been made to Luer County assignments. And then finally, CMS is going to still continue to have wage index adjustments based upon commuting patterns. One thing I wanted to do in this presentation was do a quick refresh with everyone for a few minutes about the proposed changes to the core-based statistical areas nationwide, which impact development of the wage index factors. So as a matter of background, the OMB is in charge of setting forth core-based statistical areas or patterns, I'll say, metropolitan and micropolitan delineations, which are used in the core-based statistical area calculations. The data that they have used, it first originated back in the 1950s, and the OMB had been using this data forever. And basically, the CBSAs were defined by county size in the following current delineations. Metropolitan areas were defined as a population of 50,000 or higher. Micropolitan areas were populations between 10,000 and less than 50,000. And then you had counties with populations that were less than 10,000 that were just deemed to be outside of the core-based statistical area. So since this data had been around for a long time and had been kind of stagnant, in 2018, the OMB tasked a committee to review the 2010 metropolitan and micropolitan area standards and to provide recommendations back by December of last year. The OMB committee issued their recommendations in a Federal Register dated January 19th of 2021, this year. And while this Federal Register is separate from the IPPS preliminary rule that we're all here for, that was issued on April 27th, the changes that are set forth in the committee's recommendations will have a long lasting impact in the development of the wage index values for future periods. So it's very relevant. In other words, it's important that you consider these recommended changes from a long-term strategy perspective. And the following is what the committee recommended. They recommended resetting the metropolitan statistical areas and they would be increased to a minimum level of 100,000 in terms of census. They also recommended to discontinue what was called New England city and town areas, mainly because that data isn't used very much. They undertook a recommendation on research to determine if further analysis should be taken to consider a territorially and exhaustive classification that covers all of the United States plus Puerto Rico. Currently, Puerto Rico their data is kind of developed on a different basis. And then a fourth recommendation is that the 2020 census that we all participated in last year would be used in the upcoming decade analysis in terms of decennial-based delineation. So that just means, in short, they're recommending that we update all the data using the 2020 census. The committee also indicated that we should make publicly available a schedule for updates to the core-based statistical areas. And then finally, their sixth recommendation is that the commuting patterns should still be, considered in this process. So under the recommendations of the committee, the OMB would release 3 different types of updates subject to the proposed standards. They would have annual updates, which in some years there may not be any updates at all. And if there are updates, it's expected that those annual updates would be small. More importantly, there would be a 5-year mid-decade update. And this is a broader update where they really roll up the sleeves and look at these statistical areas and make changes. And then finally, you have the decennial delineation, which incorporates the 5-year update plus the update for the new census every 10 years. So that's kind of the approach that the OMB committee and what was published in the Federal Register looks like. They did put out a table that shows the expected release dates for all these updates. So the key first date on the schedule is June of 2023, which, believe it or not, is only a short 2 years away from now. So that's when we're going to see probably some major changes, and then we'll have annual updates, 5-year updates, and then eventually you would have your 10-year update. In this slide, we wanted to provide an illustration of the likely geographic areas that may experience a change in their CBSA status. So the highlighted areas are those that from the 2018 census data that the OMB is working with have a census between 50,000 but less than 100,000 population. So under the OMB committee's recommendations, these highlighted areas may revert back to a micropolitan status and lose their current CBSA status. And it's worth noting that in 2018, there were 392 micropolitan areas with a census between 50,000 and less than 100,000. CMS projects that 144 of these areas may be at risk of losing their metropolitan status and will likely be absorbed into larger geographic areas. So if we pivot back to the IPPS proposed rule, CMS is proposing that geographic changes stemming from the OMB Bulletin 1804 be applied in a hold harmless manner. This is interesting because the hold harmless proposal, given the recent development that we just discussed, where the OMB is issued its recommendation to redesignate metropolitan and micropolitan statistical areas using higher census thresholds and the 2020 census count as its basis. Based upon this proposal, I could see a scenario where it's plausible CMS may implement a hold harmless approach to core-based statistical areas once the OMB is done with their redesignation work and resetting geographic areas. So something to look forward to in future rules. And another interesting development set forth in the IPPS preliminary rule is a proposal to use a different home area for certain hospitals that are designated as rural for purposes of meeting the wage test as part of a geographic reclassification background. So as a matter of background, there is a process and a separate body called the Medicare Geographic Classification Review Board that sets forth rules and allows hospitals to geographically reclass from one area to another. Under the existing rules, an applicant hospital is required to demonstrate that its average hourly wages are a certain percentage greater than the wages of other hospitals in its home area. Also, there's a wage test for the area that you're moving to, but for purposes of the rules, CMS considers a hospital's home area to be the area in which it is physically located. That's been the rule up to this point, even if the hospital has elected to be treated as if it were part of a rural area of the state. In other words, a rural reclassification. Hospitals recently and successfully challenged this policy in a case called Bates County Memorial Hospital. And in that case, there were 6 urban hospitals that elected to reclassify as rural, but they were denied geographic reclassification because their average hourly wages were compared to their geographic home areas. The hospital said that's wrong. They said, we are reclassified rural hospitals. Our average hourly wages should be compared to the average hourly wages of the hospitals in the rural areas of the respective states. And the court heard the case, and they decided in favor for plaintiff hospitals. And this was at the federal district court level, and the government has decided not to appeal. So, given the large, when you look at this in its totality, given the large number of hospitals in recent years that have redesignated themselves as rural providers in order to do things like participate in a 340B program or to get sole community hospital status or what have you, it's plausible that the MGCRB will see an increase in the number of geographic reclassifications in the coming years. It's just the tea leaves are pointing in that direction. Consequently, if an urban hospital reclassifies as rural, its eligibility for geographic reclassification will now be determined based upon a comparison of its average hourly wage to the average hourly wages of the hospitals located in the rural area of the state. In addition, in determining whether the area to which the hospital seeks to reclassify has a lower reclassified average hourly wage than the hospital's home, CMS will compare the pre-reclassified average hourly wage of the target area to the pre-reclassified average hourly wage of the rural area. All of this change is actually in a separate interim final rule that's dated May 10th, 2021. But this is kind of a hot off the press item. That's why we included it in this presentation. Comments to this are due by June 28th. And we're hoping or expecting that this revision to this rule will be in effect for the upcoming reclassification filings that are due on or about September 1st of this year. So we'll have to keep tabs on this and see if it progresses in the way we expect. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Amy, for a polling question, number 3.
All right, thank you. So this polling question is, have you conducted any financial impact analysis of the OMB's recommendation on changes to geographic delineations expected to be released on June 2023? A, yes, B, no, or C, unsure. And while you're responding, for those of you that would like a copy of today's slides, you can download them from the folder that says slide deck and handouts. And we will also be sending the slides via email tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast. Okay, and here are the results.
So I see a fair number of folks have answered no. I don't think that's unexpected. We do have 2 years of, in terms of time to get through this. And so what I would just recommend is keep tabs on these new geographic delineations. They could offer up opportunities, and they might close certain payment avenues that you currently have. So a lot of to be continued on this item. So with that, I don't want to take up any more time, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Mike Newell. He'll talk about Medicare DISH.
Thanks, Glenn. I appreciate it. Got a lot of material to cover here, so we'll try to move through it quickly, but I do want to spend a little time on some of the salient points. Just as a refresher, the uncompensated care pool program is based on estimates made by CMS in factors 1, 2, and 3, and it begins with factor 1, which is an estimate of what Medicare DISH would have been had the Affordable Care Act not been enacted in 2010. And CMS uses a variety of sources to arrive at this number, which is also certified by the CMS Office of the Actuary. But there's been some significant movement in these dollars this year that I wanted to spend a little time on with this slide, making sure everybody sort of understands, because I think this may be an opportunity for some comments. So the story here is that there have been some significant changes in the so-called roll-forward factors, in large part due to assumptions made regarding utilization under COVID, as well as a migration from fee-for-service to Medicare Advantage plans. And this is sort of a common theme that you heard from Paul and Glenn in terms of data points CMS is choosing to use to try to smooth out numbers based on the presumption that the pandemic period is resulting in information that may not be fair. But there's a significant difference here in the starting point, and I just wanted to point you to I'm not going to go through all the factors, but I want to point you to the last column in DISH so that you can see that the baseline beginning point is $13.9 billion, and it was $14 billion last year using the 2017 cost report. So we're starting at roughly the same place. But the projection forward changes dramatically. So if you look at the 2019 for this year, it's right at $14.1 billion. Last year it was $14.9 billion. If you go to 20, now it's $12.9 billion, and last year it was projected to be $14.5 billion, so a whopping $1.6 billion difference year over year, just due to the update of all these factors that you see in red, which have gone down. And then if you go to 2021, now projected to be $12.541 billion, you may recall last year it was $15.171 billion, and that was our final factor 1 that was ultimately adjusted by the empirically justified amount and used in factor 2. And then you get a pretty large uptick in 2022 where CMS seems to believe that as we return to whatever it is we're returning to that some people may call normal, there's going to be a pretty significant uptick in the number. So you can see the total update for 2022 is 12.42%. That gets us to almost $14.1 billion, but that's still over $1 billion less than what factor 1 was last year. So once you apply the empirically justified amount of $3.5 billion, we end up with a factor 1 of almost $10.6 billion, which is $800 million off of where we started last year. So when you look at your final allocations, at least in part, you can trace it back to the starting point here. This is just a trending graph, so you can kind of see where we've been since the inception of the program in 2014. And if you look at the last column, factor 1, steady climb until we got to 2020. And now we're on a pretty steep decline in the last 2 years, in large part as a result of some of the factors that CMS is choosing to use to make these estimates. I won't spend a lot of time on factor 2 because, frankly, it didn't change that much. You can see that by estimating the uninsured rate for 2021 and 2022. The current adjustment factor is 72.14 versus 72.86 last year. So, one thing I think we should think about is this slide seems to indicate that the rate of uninsured is going to stay roughly the same as was predicted for 21 and 22. But the pool of money, as you'll see when the pool gets adjusted in the next slide, is going to drop over $660 million. So what that basically says is hospitals are essentially going to be treating roughly the same number of uninsured people, but you're going to have $662 million less funding with which to do that with. So I think that those are some important concepts for hospitals certainly to think about as they're looking at this information and weighing whether or not they should comment with regard to this. You know, it was interesting in Glenn's slide that showed the case mix index. You know, while utilization was certainly disrupted during the pandemic period, at least in case mix, I think one would have expected that who went to the hospital were still the sickest patients. So it's not always, I think, wise to maybe try to smooth out some of this information, depending on how it affects you. Again, just another graph to kind of show you where we've been since the inception of the program. In the last 2 years, it's certainly seen a significant drop-off in funding for hospitals for uncompensated care, again, through a pandemic where we've had, some unprecedented unemployment numbers. And then that gets us to factor 3. And factor 3 is the factor that's computed for each individual hospital based on its uncompensated care cost information reported in your annual Medicare cost report filing. And for this particular year, CMS is using the audited data from the 2018 cost reports. Hospitals on the call are certainly well aware of what they went through last year with regard to audits. Some hospitals have been going through it for several years when they were doing audits on about 25% of the hospitals. And pretty much all of you are probably in the middle of your 2019 audit now. So the information that's being used to distribute this money is based on audited data, and you'll see some pretty significant shifts in that data that's playing into it as well. And then sort of another item that's being driven a little bit by, a data point that is or is not, within the COVID-19 pandemic period is how they compute interim payments. And while it used to be a 3-year average, it's been reduced now to a 2-year average using 2018 and 2019. But this is something I think you're going to have to watch carefully as you go forward, especially as you're kind of estimating any due to, due from balances to Medicare as utilization changes in the 2022 year. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time talking about the audits, and I'm not going to get into specific issues related to the audits. We've done this on other webcasts that we could certainly share with you. But before I get into the numbers, I'm going to turn it back over to Amy, and we're going to have another polling question.
All right, thank you. So our last polling question is, given the continued increase in regulatory reporting and reimbursement changes, how do you feel about your or your organization's bandwidth? A, we are good. B, we struggle but stay on top of issues. C, we are not keeping up at all. Or D, we outsource and let someone else worry about that. And once you've completed all CPE requirements, you will be able to download a PDF of your certificate from the CPE Progress window. And as a reminder, if you attended today's presentation in a group and would like to receive CPE credit, you must complete the group attendance sheet found in your console. Leave this up here for a few more seconds. Okay, here are the results.
So again, there's a fair number of hospitals that have this under control, but there's still some out there that are struggling with this. And I can tell you, having worked with a lot of hospitals on this, it will continue to be a struggle. And I think that'll be evident in some of the numbers that we're going to go over now kind of quickly based on the audit results. So what we did is compare what was in the HCRA file for the 2018 cost reports sort of on an as-filed basis before the audit results were uploaded into HCRA, and then after the audit results were uploaded. And you can see on this first slide, of the 2,378 hospitals, 2,208 had changes to line 30 that actually resulted in a reduction of $1.4 billion or almost 4.5%. So this is a significant movement, and because this is a closed pool and all subject to redistribution, has effects really on everyone, not just the hospitals that had an impact to their line 30. If you go a little bit deeper on this slide and look at the line 20, which is charity, you can see uninsured charity ticked up a little bit at $625 million, but insured charity significantly declined at $1.2 billion. And this is very important because insured charity is not generally subject to the cost to charge ratio unless it includes some exhausted benefit charges. So that's sort of a dollar for dollar impact. So hospitals that saw significant changes there, felt the pain rather quickly. And in terms of bad debts, this is like 2 years in a row CMS and the MACs have sort of focused on non-Medicare bad debts. Last year, the decline related to audits was like $3 billion. Now it's $2.7 billion. Big focus item, something that hospitals really need to be spending some time on in terms of their revenue cycle and their collection policies and how well they're following those policies. It's also an area that leads generally to some large extrapolations in audits because of just the size of the dollars that are involved. And then just to give you a little bit of perspective, in terms of line 30, the largest decrease for a hospital in the country in line 30 was almost $160 million, which, as you can see, results in a significant impact on actual payments. And the largest increase was just under $50 million also. So for those that answered, we may still be struggling. I think you can see from the data that the data is moving around a lot, some based on reporting and some based on audits. So it's something to keep an eye on. I certainly would be looking at my 19 numbers now and working through the audits, and I'd also be considering whether or not to amend the 2020 to try to get that straight if you learn something from a prior audit that may have some applicability on how you're pulling the numbers together in a future period. And then with the few remaining minutes that we have, I wanted to basically touch on a change proposed for Section 1115 waivers. There's been sort of 3 cases in recent history that have shaped CMS's now new view of this issue. The most recent being Bethesda that had to do with Florida cases, Forest General, and then Health Alliance, which was a Massachusetts case. And sort of the bottom line is where these 1115 waiver programs do things like reimburse hospitals through uncompensated care pools or provide premium assistance for waiver patients to purchase insurance. In CMS's position, it's not meeting the definition of providing inpatient hospital insurance benefits directly to the patient on the covered day, and that's what they're objecting to. So I'm not going to get into the legal fight that's probably going to ensue over this because of this issue, but I think it's important to look at if you're including waiver days, how's the waiver set up in your state, and how are you being paid, and what will be the implications for trying to meet this standard. As Paul pointed out in his presentation, certainly the cost report is used for many things, one of which is recalibrating weights and payments. And CMS had previously issued an instruction to start including some Medicare managed organization information with the intent of folding that data into the calculation of relative weights in 2024, ultimately determined based on input from hospitals that this was a significant burden and therefore decided to pull this back. So the 2024 weights will continue to be computed, at least as of now, based on the methodology that's currently in place. And with that, I'm out of time. I'm going to leave you with a few slides that cover new reporting requirements for both Medicare DSH and uncompensated care charity and bad debts, effective with cost reporting periods beginning on or after October 1st, 2020, and ask you to spend some time reviewing the Paperwork Reduction Act notice that came out in November 2020 regarding these requirements. And if you have some questions, just go ahead and shoot them to us. And with that, I'll leave you here with some resources that we have available for you that you're certainly welcome to use. Feel free and hope there's some help there. Unfortunately, we're right at the ending mark, so we won't have time for questions today, but we will follow up any questions that are submitted. So if you have them, please go ahead and do so, and we'll follow up with them later. And with that, I think I'll turn it back to Amy for quick closing remarks.
All right, thank you. And thank you, Paul, Glenn, and Michael, for a great presentation today. And thank you to our audience for your participation and for submitting all your questions. As mentioned, since we didn't have time for Q&A, we will do our best to follow up with you after the webcast. Also, here are the contact information for the presenters. So if you have additional questions, please reach out to them as well. And if you met all CPE requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. I will keep the webcast console open for a few minutes to give you time to download. And a copy will be emailed within three weeks should you have difficulty downloading it now. And here is a link to an online survey for today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete this survey as your feedback is very important to us. And thank you for joining our webcast. We hope you'll join us again next time.